The candle had burned to within an inch of its socket, and she had not noticed. That was the first thing the narrator must confess of her, before anything else is understood, that she could lose the hour, lose the room, lose the ache climbing her spine, when a sentence would not yield its meaning. Her hand hovered above the page, pen suspended, a single bead of ink trembling at the nib like a held breath. Below it, 3 lines of her own careful transcription sat unfinished, the Greek letters marching into Latin shapes that refused, still, to resolve into sense. Wax had pooled and hardened along the brass candlestick in uneven rings, a small history of how long she had sat there, motionless but for the thinking. Somewhere beyond the library door, deep in the sleeping body of the house, a clock struck the half-hour. She counted it without meaning to. 11:30, which meant, by her own reckoning, some 6 hours remained before the sky beyond the tall windows would gray, and then pale, and then admit that unforgiving country dawn that arrives whether or not a woman has finished her work, before the household would wake, take its chocolate and its judgment in the same breath, and ask whether the governess had made a fool of herself after all, or of them. She flexed her fingers. Ink had dried in the creases of her knuckles, dark as a bruise. It is worth pausing here, before the account moves forward, to promise the reader what will not be withheld. How a woman raised on a curate's stipend and her father's stubborn insistence that Greek was no less her inheritance than her brother's, had they lived to want one, came to be sitting alone past midnight in a duke's library, racing a candle toward a page that had defeated 3 Oxford men before her. How an evening meant to humble her had instead placed in her hands a secret 11 years buried. How the outcome of this single night would alter, quietly and irreversibly, the shape of more than one life beneath that roof. But that is to run ahead of the tale, and the tale deserves its proper telling. For now, it is enough to know this. The room was very cold, the fire long since collapsed to embers, and the cabinet behind her stood open for the first time in over a decade, its mahogany doors, like the wings of something newly woken. Papers lay fanned across the desk in the low, buttery light, brittle, foxed at the edges, dense with a dead man's private cipher, and the young woman bent over them, plain in her gray wool dress, her hair coming loose from its pins, was doing something no one in that house, least of all the mocking old woman who had arranged this evening as sport, believed she could do. She dipped her pen again. The clock's half-hour chime had already faded into the walls, but somewhere beneath the silence that followed, the night had begun, in earnest, to count itself down. The bridge is easily crossed, and the tale returns willingly to its beginning, as any honest telling must. It had been Tuesday, the 14th of September, and the morning had come to Marlstoke gray and close, with a mist that clung to the chimney-pots and did not lift until nearly 10. In a small rented room above a chandler's shop, 2 windows, a narrow bed, a washstand chipped at the lip, the vicar's daughter turned governess had been mending a glove by candlelight, for the morning gave little enough of its own, when the landlady's boy knocked, and handed up a card on a salver borrowed, no doubt for the occasion, since the household kept none of its own. The card was heavy. That was the first thing she noticed, heavier than any paper she had touched since her father's death, when the bishop had written his brief, formal condolence on stock, so fine it had seemed almost an insult to grief. This card bore the Wrenwood crest, pressed deep into cream vellum, and beneath it, in a hand not the Duke's but his mother's, she knew this instinctively, before she had even reasoned why, an invitation to dine at the hall that same evening, at 7. She read it twice. Then she set it on the washstand and returned to her glove, though her needle did not move for some minutes. It was not that such invitations never came to governesses. They did, occasionally, when a household wished to display its liberality, or when a companion was needed to fill an empty chair at short notice. But she had been 3 years in Marlstoke, teaching the vicar's own grandchildren their letters, and, when pressed, a little Latin, and in 3 years no card had come from the hall, nor any word from its mistress, beyond a nod exchanged at market. She thought of the gossip that had passed, lately, through the shops and the churchyard, that the vicar's daughter read Greek as her father had taught her, that she had once corrected the schoolmaster's translation of a psalm without meaning insult, That word of this had reached, as such things do, ears far above her station. She thought, too, of her father, 3 years dead now, who had taught her the alphabet of Homer, at this very washstand's twin in the vicarage, believing knowledge itself no sin, whatever the world made of a woman who possessed it. She thought of the 40 pounds a year that stood between her and the poorhouse, and of how little power she held to refuse a duchess's summons even had she wished to. She did wish to refuse it. She could not have said precisely why, only that the card's warmth sat oddly against its weight, the way a smile can sit oddly on a face that means something else entirely. She dressed that evening in her one good gown, gray wool, carefully brushed, and told herself it was only dinner. The house that employed her stood at the edge of the market town, a square brick residence belonging to a wool merchant grown prosperous enough to want his daughters accomplished, though not so prosperous as to pay for the accomplishment generously. She had held the position 3 years, since her father's death emptied the vicarage and left her with his books, his watch, and little else. The schoolroom smelled of chalk dust, and the tallow candles the merchant's wife would not replace with wax, though the family dined by wax below. 2 girls, aged 9 and 12, sat each morning at a scarred table while she taught them their letters, their sums, a little French pronounced badly by her own admission, and the pianoforte scales she had learned, only so she might teach them, note by careful note, a week ahead of her pupils. Her wages came to 40 pounds a year, paid quarterly, and from this she found board deducted, and the cost of her own candles when the household ration ran short, and a shilling now and again sent to her father's old housekeeper, gone blind, and living on charity, in the almshouse at Little Denning. What remained she spent on almost nothing. Her gowns were turned and returned, her gloves were mended at the fingertips with thread near enough the color not to show. She had grown skilled at the particular arithmetic of genteel poverty, how a fire might be allowed to burn low without seeming to be denied, how a single good bonnet might serve 3 seasons if brushed and retrimmed, how to decline an invitation to card-playing without confessing she could not afford the stakes. What she had, instead of money, were the books. Her father had kept a modest shelf, Homer in the Greek, a battered Virgil, a testament in 3 languages he had used to teach her the alphabet before she was 7, tracing the letters into the flour dust on the kitchen table, because paper was dear and flour was not. He had believed, against the practice of most clergymen of his acquaintance, that a daughter's mind wanted the same furnishing as a son's, though he had been careful, always, to teach her in private, in the hours after her mother's death when the parish had other things to occupy its gossip. She had grown up believing this an ordinary inheritance, until she was old enough to understand that other girls of her station received needlework and hymnals, and that her own learning was a thing to be concealed rather than shown, a coal kept banked rather than a fire lit for warmth. She had not meant the schoolmaster to overhear her correction of his psalm. She had not meant for it to travel, and yet here she stood now, in her one good gown, the invitation's gilt edge catching the last gray light through the window, wondering what a duchess could want with a governess's Greek, and why the wanting felt, already, like something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The rain began as she turned onto the long avenue of limes, and by the time the hired trap drew up beneath the porte cochere, it had settled into the steady, businesslike sort that seemed to know it had all night to fall. She counted the hours she had left before the appointed time, not yet 6, and dinner not until 7, and found the counting did nothing to slow the beating of her own pulse against her collarbone. Wrenwood Hall did not so much welcome her as consent to her presence. The great door opened onto a hall of black and white marble, cold enough that she felt it through the soles of her boots, and so vast that the single fire laid in the hearth at its far end seemed less a comfort than a rumor of warmth, offered and withdrawn in the same breath. Portraits climbed the walls in gilt frames gone dull with a century of wood smoke, generations of Wrenwood men, regarding her descent from the trap with the same expression, she thought, that their descendants would likely wear tonight. Somewhere above her a clock, she would learn later it was the long case clock on the first landing, kept, out of old habit, 4 minutes fast, began to strike the half-hour, and the sound rolled down the staircase and settled over her like a hand laid flat upon the back of her neck. A footman took her wet cloak with the particular carefulness of a man handling something he privately considered beneath his notice. She stood a moment in her one good gown, feeling the damp had reached her stockings despite the trap's canvas hood, and reminding herself that cold feet had never yet prevented her from construing a line of Homer correctly, and would not begin tonight. It was then that she saw him. He stood in the doorway of what she would come to know as the small drawing room, half in shadow, dressed with the plain severity of a man who had long ago stopped dressing to please anyone, least of all himself. He did not come forward. He did not speak. He regarded her, she would use that word afterward, in the privacy of her own thoughts, because no gentler one fit, with an attention that took in the mend at her glove's seam and the damp hem of her gown, and gave away nothing at all of what conclusion he drew from either. His mother's laughter, faint and already amused at something, drifted from beyond the far door, but he did not turn toward it. He watched Ada instead, in silence, for the length of time it took the footman to fold her cloak over his arm and withdraw, and in all that time he did not once incline his head in greeting. She thought, "He already knows why I have been asked here." And she understood, with the same cold clarity that had once told her a schoolmaster's psalm was wrongly rendered, that the evening would not be endured so much as survived. The dining room, when at last she was led into it, smelled of beeswax and roasted fowl, and something colder beneath both, the particular chill of a house that had once entertained more freely, and now performed hospitality out of habit rather than warmth. Candles stood in a silver épergne down the table's center, their light catching on crystal that had not been dusted quite recently enough, and by their glow she counted places for perhaps 10, though the room might once have seated 40. A clergyman's wife, a colonel's spinster sister, a pale young man who never once addressed her directly, and at the head, presiding with the ease of long custom, the Dowager, resplendent in gray silk and a fichu of old lace, her eyes finding Ada's the instant she crossed the threshold, and holding them with an interest too pointed to be mistaken for welcome. "Ah," she said, before the soup had even been removed. "Our little scholar." Ada inclined her head and said nothing, which she had learned long ago was the only answer that could not be turned against her. "I understand you read Greek," the Dowager continued, addressing the table at large, though her gaze did not leave Ada's face. "Actual Greek, not merely the alphabet, as some young ladies fancy they know it from a governess's primer, but the language entire, Homer. Is that not remarkable?" She turned to the colonel's sister. "Is that not the most remarkable thing you have heard this fortnight?" The colonel's sister murmured that it was very remarkable indeed, and looked at her plate. "My late husband," the Dowager went on, "always said a woman who claimed Greek was either a genius or a liar, and he had met perhaps one genius in his life, and she was not a governess." A small, expectant pause, into which the pale young man laughed once, too quickly, and subsided. "You must forgive my curiosity, Miss Fenwick. It is not every day one dines with a prodigy." "I make no claim to prodigy, Your Grace," Ada said, "only to instruction. My father taught me from the time I could hold a pen steady." "How charming, a father's indulgence." The Dowager set down her spoon with the precision of a woman placing a card she believed would win the hand. "Then you will not mind being tested a little, among friends. Purely for the diversion of it." Her smile did not reach the eyes fixed so steadily, so pleasantly, on Ada's face. "I have always been fond of the Odyssey myself. There is a line I recall. Homer's man of many wiles, was it not, who longed all his days to look upon the smoke rising from his own hearth?" She recited it then, slowly, with the confident cadence of a woman who has never once been corrected in her own dining room, and waited, visibly, delightedly, to see what the little governess would dare to say to a duchess. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick as the tallow smoke curling from the candles along the table's center, and into that silence, the clock upon the mantel ticked with what seemed a deliberate cruelty, marking the seconds in which a governess might be expected to nod, to smile, to murmur her admiration for a duchess's memory, and let the matter rest there, unexamined, as any sensible woman of her station would surely do. She did not nod. She set down her fork with a small, precise click against the china. Cold china, for she had eaten almost nothing since the soup, her appetite long since abandoned to the tightness in her chest. And she felt, rather than saw, every eye at that table settle upon her, waiting to watch a governess drown. "Your Grace recites it beautifully," she said, and there was no mockery in it, only the flat courtesy of a woman raised to speak carefully in rooms where she did not belong. "Though I believe the line runs a little differently. It is not the smoke of his own hearth that Odysseus longs to see rising. It is only the smoke, however humble, of his native land. The hearth comes after, in a different line entirely, and speaks not of longing, but of the swineherd's fire." The pale young man's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "A small distinction," Ada continued, quieter now, aware of the precipice beneath each word. "But the meter will not bear the substitution. The dactyls fall wrong if one forces the hearth into that place. My father used to say, a man might paraphrase Scripture and be forgiven, but paraphrase Homer, and the verse itself will betray him." She did not look away from the Dowager as she said it. She had learned long ago, in schoolrooms far colder than this one, that the moment one dropped one's eyes was the moment the argument was lost, regardless of who held the better claim to truth. The Dowager's smile did not waver, not at first. It merely stiffened at its edges, the way frost stiffens along a window pane before it cracks. A footman near the sideboard had gone very still. Down the table, an older gentleman with heavy side whiskers set down his glass with exaggerated care, as though the sound of it striking wood might be misread as applause. "How very thorough," the Dowager said at last, and her voice had cooled by several careful degrees. "One forgets, among governesses, how seriously the profession is taken." "It is only a line, Your Grace," Ada said. "I would not have troubled to correct it, had you not asked me to attend so closely." It was, perhaps, the smallest of provocations, an accusation dressed as modesty, and it landed exactly where she had aimed it, though her heart beat hard enough now that she felt certain the whole table must hear it. The Dowager's eyes narrowed by a fraction, some calculation passing swift behind them, and at the head of the table, where he had said almost nothing through 3 full courses, the Duke set down his wineglass. The sound was small, glass against linen, no more than a tap, but it drew every eye down the length of the table as surely as a struck bell. He did not speak at once. He merely looked at her, and there was nothing in his face she could read, no encouragement and no warning, only the flat attention of a man reassessing a piece of furniture he had believed he understood. "Perhaps," the Dowager said, recovering herself, "the young woman would care to demonstrate her thoroughness once more, for the table's benefit." Her tone suggested a kindness she did not intend. Ada set down her fork. She had learned, in 6 years of governessing, that the request to perform was rarely a request at all, and that refusal carried its own cost, so she folded her hands instead, and spoke the line again, this time in full, the Greek unbroken, each syllable given its proper weight, the dactyls falling where her father had taught her they must fall, in the small cold study at Marlstoke with rain against the glass, and his finger tapping the meter against the desk. She rendered it into English afterward, plainly, without ornament, and named the book and the line number, though she had not been asked for either. For a moment, nobody at the table moved. The old gentleman with the side whiskers had gone quite red about the ears. A young woman near the foot of the table, a niece, perhaps, or a poor relation kept for company, stared at Ada with an expression that might have been envy, or might have been something closer to relief, as though she had waited years to see the Dowager's certainty meet an equal, and had begun to think she never would. The Dowager laughed. It was not a large laugh, nor an unkind one to hear. That was its cruelty. It was light, almost fond, the laugh of a woman amused by a clever pet. "How charming," she said, "to keep such a memory. Like a dog reciting Scripture, is it not? One is astonished, and then one remembers it is only trained." She looked about the table for agreement, and found it, dutifully, in a ripple of soft laughter that came a beat too late to be genuine, and a beat too quick to be refused. Ada felt the heat climb her throat and made herself sit very still, the way she had been taught to sit through worse, through her father's funeral, through the reading of his debts, through 100 small dinners where she had been tolerated rather than welcomed. She did not answer. She had learned that silence, held correctly, could not be laughed at. It was the Duke who broke it. "A trained dog," he said slowly, turning his glass by its stem, not looking at his mother, "does not correct a duchess's Greek and then apologize for the trouble of it." He looked, at last, directly at Ada, and something in his gaze had shifted, though she could not yet have named what. The small sound of the glass meeting mahogany was nothing, a mere settling of crystal on wood, yet it silenced the table more thoroughly than a struck bell might have done. Conversation, which had been rippling pleasantly around the matter of the assizes and a neighbor's new carriage horses, folded in upon itself and stopped. Even the Dowager, who had opened her mouth to redirect the evening toward safer ground, closed it again and turned her head toward her son with the particular stillness of a woman recalculating. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Ada, and there was in his face none of the indulgent amusement that had passed around the table a moment before, nor any trace of mockery at all. It was, she thought, the face of a man weighing something privately, testing its soundness, the way one tests a floorboard, before committing full weight to it. "You quoted the line correctly," he said, "and its meter besides. That is more than the tutor my mother engaged, for my sisters ever managed." And he came with references from Cambridge. A faint sound from the Dowager's end of the table, not quite a protest, not quite agreement, which he did not acknowledge. "I wonder, Miss Fenwick, whether you might be persuaded to attempt something rather harder than a misremembered line at dinner." The candlelight caught the stem of his glass as he turned it, slow revolutions that seemed to buy him time he did not otherwise take. "There is a cabinet in the library," he said. "Mahogany, locked, and has been locked for 11 years. My father's private papers are in it, journals, for the most part, kept in his final years. Some portion of them is written in a cipher none of us has troubled to break. We tried, in the year after his death. 3 men came from Oxford, each with excellent credentials, and each left after a fortnight admitting defeat, though none of them admitted it gracefully. A dry note entered his voice, gone as quickly as it came. The cipher is built on Greek, or so the one of the 3 who lasted longest believed, before he too surrendered." He set the glass down again, more gently this time, and the second sound was smaller than the first, hardly a sound at all. "I do not ask this lightly," he said. "The papers have sat untouched because no one in this house wished to be the one who could not read them, and because—" He stopped and did not finish the thought aloud, though something in the pause suggested the sentence had an ending he had considered many times and never spoken. "Will you try?" The Dowager's laughter, which had filled the room so easily not 5 minutes before, had gone entirely silent, and in its place was something sharper, more attentive, the expression of a woman watching her joke slip its leash. Ada said nothing for a moment, and the silence stretched long enough that the footman near the sideboard shifted his weight, and the candles seemed to burn a fraction slower for the waiting. Somewhere behind the head of the table, near the sideboard where the decanters caught what light remained, the old butler's face performed a small, private betrayal, a flicker at the corner of the mouth, a stillness in the eyes that had not been there a moment before, gone almost before it could be read, folded back beneath the composed blankness that 40 years of service had taught him to wear like a second skin. But the flicker had happened, she had seen it, and so, she suspected, had the Duke, though he did not turn to look. 11 years, she said, not quite a question. 11 years this November, the Duke answered. The cabinet has not been opened since the week after the funeral, when my mother's brother thought to look for a will that had already been read. He found the journals instead, and did not know what to do with them, and so they were locked again, and the key given to— He inclined his head slightly toward the sideboard, and the butler, without being asked to speak, said only, "I have kept it, Your Grace," in a voice so level it might have been discussing the weather, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested the object in question had weighed on him rather more than its size would warrant. "Mahogany," the Duke added, as though the detail mattered, as though naming the wood might make the thing less formidable. "A writing cabinet, in the library, beside the northern window. My father kept it locked even in his lifetime. I do not believe my mother ever saw inside it." The Dowager's fork, which had been resting against her plate in an attitude of amused patience, did not move now at all. "Because there was nothing in it worth seeing," she said, though the certainty in her voice had thinned considerably since the soup course. "Perhaps," the Duke said, in a tone that closed the matter without agreeing to it. He looked at Ada again, and this time he did not look away. "3 Oxford men could not break it. I do not offer you the task expecting a different result. I offer it because a fortnight ago I would have said the same of Homer and been wrong." The words landed with more weight than their length should have carried, and Ada felt the eyes of the table shift toward her all at once. The Dowager's narrowed and calculating, the young cousins frankly delighted, the butlers carefully, deliberately fixed upon the middle distance, as though he had already guessed how the evening would end, and did not trust his own face to hide it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room without words, but the silence of a room in which every person present was calculating the exact shape of what had just occurred, and none of them arrived at quite the same figure. The Dowager recovered first, as she always did, setting her fork down with the precise, unhurried motion of a woman who had never in her life allowed a room to see her flinch. "How very charitable of you," she said to her son, "to hand the girl a second humiliation before she has finished digesting the first." "I had not thought of it as charity," the Duke said. "No," the Dowager agreed, and there was something almost pleasant now in her voice, the pleasure of a woman who believed she had merely been handed a longer rope. "You had thought of it as a test, which is worse, in its way, for her. A parlor trick may be forgiven. Failure at a serious task cannot be laughed off quite so easily." She turned to Ada with an expression of consideration so exaggerated it might have been mistaken, by a less attentive observer, for genuine sympathy. "You need not attempt it, of course. No one would think less of you for declining what 3 Oxford men could not manage." It was, Ada understood at once, not an offer of mercy, but the final turn of the trap, for to decline now, before the whole table, would confirm every suspicion the evening had been built to prove, and to accept was to walk further into a contest she had not sought and could not be certain of winning. The young cousin, still delighted, watched her with the frank anticipation of a child at a cockfight. The butler had not moved his eyes from the middle distance, but his hands, folded at his back, had gone very still, and Ada had the sudden, curious sensation of being watched by a man who had already decided, privately, which outcome he hoped for. "I have not yet seen the cabinet," she said, "nor the hand it was written in. I should be a poor scholar to refuse a text before reading a line of it." "Spoken," the Dowager said, with the faint, satisfied smile of a woman closing an account she believed already settled in her favor, like someone who has not yet understood the size of the debt she is proposing to pay. No one corrected her. The Duke rose, and with him the small formalities of the table's dissolution began, chairs drawn back, napkins folded, the candles on the sideboard guttering low in their sockets, and somewhere beneath the ordinary business of the house, the great clock in the hall struck the half-hour past 9, and the sound carried through the corridors like a small warning bell that no one but she seemed to hear. The library, when they came to it, smelled of tallow and old paper, and the particular mustiness of rooms kept shut against the weather for the better part of a decade. The windows were tall and unlit, their panes throwing back the candlelight in long, wavering strips, and the shelves rose into a darkness the eye could not follow to its end. A fire had been laid but not yet caught, and the man who knelt to strike it worked with the deliberate slowness of someone who wished to remain in the room a moment longer than duty required. The butler crossed to the far wall, where a cabinet of dark mahogany stood between 2 windows, its brass fittings dulled with age, its keyhole worn pale at the edges from a hand that had once opened it often and had then, for 11 years, stopped. He produced from beneath his coat a ring of keys so heavy it made a small, grave sound against his hip, and selected one, not by looking, she noticed, but by feel, as a man selects a key he has not needed in years, yet has never once forgotten. The lock turned with a reluctance that seemed almost personal, a small grinding protest, and then the door swung open, on a hinge, that had not been oiled since whatever silence had first closed it. Inside lay the journals. 6 of them, perhaps 7, bound in leather gone brittle and dark, their spines cracked, their pages swollen slightly with old damp. The butler lifted the topmost with both hands, the way one lifts a thing that has been asked to be forgotten and resents the asking, and set it upon the reading table beneath the single candle that had been provided for her use. She looked at the hand upon the open page, cramped, forward-leaning, the ink browned with time, the letters crowded together, as though the writer had feared running out of paper, or perhaps of nerve, and understood, before she had translated a single word, that this was not the hand of a man writing for other eyes. "The room is yours until dawn," the Duke said, from somewhere behind her, his voice carrying none of the mockery the evening had promised her at its outset. "No one will disturb you. There is coal, if you require the fire built higher. There is tea, if the housekeeper is asked. And if I do not finish, then you do not finish." He said it without unkindness and without hope, and she could not have told which of the two wounded her more. The candle, newly lit, stood perhaps 6 inches in its stick. She had read enough by tallow to know roughly what such a length would grant her, and what it would not, and she did not permit herself to look at it again as the door closed, softly, upon the last of them, and the small, steady counting of its burning began. She drew the first page toward her by its corner, as though it might crumble at a heavier touch, and set herself to the plain work of looking before the harder work of understanding. The hand, once her eye had adjusted to its slant, was not so illegible as it had first appeared. The trouble lay not in the letters themselves, but in their company, for scattered among the familiar Latin endings, the, and aurum, and ibis, that any schoolroom would have taught her, sat characters that belonged to no Latin alphabet at all, a theta where a word should have closed, a lambda folded into the middle of what she took to be. Aqua. She copied a dozen such intrusions onto a fresh sheet, not troubling yet to guess their sense, only to see them assembled apart from the sentences that housed them, the way her father had once taught her to lay stray Greek particles side by side on a slate until their pattern, if pattern there were, might show itself plainly. It did not show itself plainly, she had expected as much, and did not permit the disappointment to slow her hand. She worked, instead, as her father had worked over accounts he distrusted, not seeking the clever leap, but refusing every door until each had been tried in turn. She counted the Greek letters across the first 3 pages, and found 7 that recurred with any frequency, no more, no fewer, and set them against the Latin words in which they nested, marking whether each fell first, last, or buried in the word's belly. She tried, and discarded, the notion that they stood merely for their own Greek sounds transliterated whole. The resulting words dissolved into nonsense within 4 lines. She tried the notion that they marked omitted letters, a scholar's shorthand, closer, but not close enough to bear the weight of a sentence. The candle, in this time, lost perhaps an inch, though she did not look at it to confirm the loss. She had trained herself, in years of marking children's slow declensions by rushlight, not to watch a flame while working, for a watched flame counts itself down faster than any clock. The tea came once, and went cold once, untouched beside her elbow, the old butler withdrawing without comment, though she felt, rather than saw, his glance pass over her papers before the door shut again. She did not think herself clever in that hour, only careful, and she understood, as she had understood most true things in her life, that carefulness was the only inheritance her father had left her, that no one could take back from her by dinner-table cruelty or a duchess's laughter. Somewhere near the bottom of the 4th page, among a cluster of thetas she had set aside 3 times already as unpromising, she noticed, without yet trusting the noticing, that the letters kept the same distance from one another as the rows of a boy's exercise book, the kind ruled for practicing an alphabet no one used past the age of 12. The clock in the passage beyond struck midnight while she was still turning that thought over, and she felt each stroke pass through the floorboards more than heard it. 12 small tremors counted against the candle's dwindling 1/3 of an inch. She had perhaps 5 hours left before the gray light that would end this Whatever it ended in, success, or the tidy failure the household had already prepared a place for at breakfast. The door opened without her bidding it, and the old butler entered again, this time with a fresh pot, steam curling thin as thread above the spout, and he set it down beside the first cup she had let go cold, saying nothing of the waste. He did not ask what she had found. He only stood a moment longer than strict duty required, his eyes moving once over the ruled pages spread before her, the columns of thetas, the boy's exercise book spacing she had only just begun to trust, and something in his face shifted, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a man who has watched a room for 40 years and knows when it has changed shape. He kept that cabinet locked himself, the butler said at last, quietly, as though the words had been waiting some while for permission to be spoken. The old Duke, I mean, in his last years, wouldn't let even his valet near it of an evening, used to sit up with it himself, past when a man his age had any business sitting up at all, candle burning down just as that one is now. He glanced at the flame, then away from it, as if he too had learned not to watch a thing that measured its own dying. We thought it grief, at the time, for the old Duchess, but grief doesn't usually keep a man writing till his hand shook, so the ink went everywhere but the page. He said no more than that. It was not his place to say more, and she understood the boundary in his silence as clearly as if he had drawn a line upon the carpet between them, a boundary of 40 years' service, of loyalties older than her presence in the room could touch. But he had given her something nonetheless, small and unlicensed, the sort of fact that does not appear in any hired scholar's report, because no hired scholar had ever stood close enough to a butler to be trusted with it. She thanked him, and he inclined his head, and was gone again, the door closing with the same soft finality as before, leaving her alone with the candle, and the thetas, and the new, uncomfortable warmth of knowing that whatever she was decoding had cost an old man his sleep before it had ever cost her hers. She poured the fresh tea and did not let it go cold this time. Then she bent again over the 4th page, counting the spaces between letters, as though they were footsteps leading somewhere she had not yet agreed to follow. The 4th page resisted her for the better part of an hour, until her eye, wandering in the particular fatigue that comes from staring too long at the same shapes, drifted to the margin rather than the text itself. There, cramped into a space no wider than a thumbnail, sat a note in a different hand from the body of the entry, smaller, hastier, the ink paler as though written in haste or in the dark. She had passed over it twice already, taking it for a blot. Now she brought the candle closer and read it properly. Wycomb's own trick, as we boys did it at the chantry desks, God forgive us the hours wasted. She sat back. The clock on the mantel, which she had not consulted in some time, for fear of what it would tell her, now drew her gaze as though it had spoken her name. 2 o'clock. 4 hours remained before the sky would begin its gray argument with the dark, and after that, whatever daylight came, it would come whether or not she had finished. But the note had given her something the hours had not, Wycomb's own trick. She knew the name, as any clergyman's daughter who had grown up hearing her father speak of the great schools would know it. William of Wycombe, founder of Winchester, and the boys who passed through his college for 400 years carrying, among their Latin and their birch marks, the small private ciphers that schoolboys everywhere devised to pass notes beneath the eyes of masters. She had never learned the Winchester cipher herself, but she knew its family, the shape of its logic, for her father had shown her a cruder cousin of it once, scratched into the flyleaf of an old grammar book he'd bought second-hand, and had laughed and called it a poor boy's enigma before teaching her how it fell apart under patience. The trick was not one alphabet substituted for another in a straight line, as she had been assuming, but a shifting key, the letters of a chosen word laid beneath the text like a ruler, each one nudging its neighbor forward or back according to its place in that word. She needed only to guess the word. She thought of the old Duke, of his years at that same college, of the note itself, the chantry desks, and tried it first, clumsily, her pencil scratching through 3 failed attempts before the 4th produced, astonishingly, a string of letters that resolved themselves into sense. Flood. Then, 2 words later, unmistakable, even half-formed. Fen. She stared at it, as though the word might dissolve if she blinked, her exhaustion forgotten entirely, the tea cooling once more without her notice. 4 hours. She had 4 hours and a key now, however imperfect, however likely to falter on the next page. She dipped her pen, steadied her hand against its trembling, and began again from the top of the passage, this time not guessing but reading, slowly, terribly, the old Duke's voice rising off the page for the first time in 11 years. The first lines came slow, each letter falling into place like a key finally biting its wards. Michaelmas rents collected, 12 tenancies, the hollow field yielding poorly for want of drainage. She exhaled. Ordinary business, the dry bones of an estate ledger, dressed up in a dead man's private hand. She had feared, in the candle's guttering hours, that the cipher might guard nothing more than vanity, some old man's wish to keep his accounts from prying clerks. But she pressed on, because 4 hours was 4 hours, and a code half broken was still a code, and something in her, the same stubbornness that had kept her reading Greek by rushlight at 9 years old, while her father slept in his chair, would not let her set down the pen, merely because the reward looked thin. She turned the page. Harvest below expectation again, wheat blighted in the low acres. I have written to the surveyor twice, and had no answer I could trust. The Latin here was stiffer than before, the sentences shorter, as though the writer had pressed the nib harder into the paper. She noted it the way she might note a change in a pupil's handwriting, not proof of anything, only a pattern worth watching. Numbers followed, sums owed, sums received, a column of figures for repairs, to a channel wall that appeared, then reappeared, 3 entries later, unrepaired still. She copied each figure faithfully into the margin of her own paper, though she could not yet say why she trusted them to matter. It was in the 4th passage that the formal cadence first cracked. The tenants at the Hollow have written again, requesting materials for the wall before the autumn rains. I have told them there is no money for it this year. And then, set apart on its own line, unlike anything that had come before it in tone. There was money. I chose the east wing roof instead. Ada set down her pen. She read the line again, though there was no cipher left to solve in it. The words themselves were plain enough now that the key held, plain as a man confessing to no one, in ink, meant to outlast him, and be read by none. The candle had burned low enough that its light no longer reached the far corner of the desk, and she drew the paper closer, without quite deciding to. Somewhere beneath the taxes and the harvests and the tallied sums, something had been building, not an accusation, not yet, only the faint, patient pressure of a man's conscience working against his own hand. She thought of the word that had unlocked the passage. Fen. 2 words from flood. She had not reached either yet in the unbroken text, but she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at the far edge of exhaustion, that when she did, the ledger's dry arithmetic would no longer be the point of any of it. The next line refused her. She had expected it. Some passages had come easily, falling open the moment the pattern beneath them declared itself, and others had resisted like a lock rusted shut, requiring 3 or 4 attempts before the teeth caught. This one did neither. It simply sat on the page, a row of Greek letters marching in false Latin order, and gave nothing back. She tried the cipher key she had used not 10 minutes before. It produced nonsense, a string of syllables that meant, if anything, less than the raw letters themselves. She tried shifting the substitution by 1 place, then 2, the way she had for an earlier passage that had turned out to be dated wrong in the old Duke's own hand, a slip of an old man's pen rather than a deliberate obscurity. Nothing yielded. The candle had burned down to a stub no taller than her smallest finger, and the wax had begun to pool, unevenly at its base, tilting the flame so that it guttered sideways, and threw her shadow long and trembling across the desk. She became aware, as if noticing it in someone else's body, that her hands had gone stiff, not merely cold, though the library held no fire past midnight, and the window glass wept faint condensation in the dark, but cramped, the fingers curling reluctantly around the pen as though they had forgotten their purpose. She flexed them once, twice, and pressed her palms flat against her skirts for what little warmth the wool offered. The clock on the mantel, which she had been studiously not watching, read a few minutes short of 3. She allowed herself, briefly, the thought she had been holding at bay since the cabinet had first been unlocked, that she had mistaken a coincidence for a key. That flood had been chance alignments, 2 words surrendering to a pattern that did not truly exist, the way a hopeful eye finds a face in the cracks of a ceiling. 3 Oxford men, men with degrees and Greek tutors from childhood, had failed at this same desk. It was not modesty, but arithmetic to suppose she might fail as they had. But she did not put down the pen. She turned instead to the marginal note she had found earlier, the one referencing the schoolboy cipher, the one that had unlocked everything else, and read it again, slowly, this time attending not to what it said, but to where it sat on the page, tucked close against a passage, some pages further on than she had yet reached. A second note, she had passed over it before as a mere flourish, an old man's doodled cross-reference. She held the candle closer, heedless of the wax now dripping onto her sleeve, and began, once more, from the beginning of the resisting line. The candle had burned down another 1/4 inch by the time the pattern surrendered itself, and when it did not arrive as triumph, but as something quieter and colder, like the moment a held breath is finally let go, and the body discovers it has been trembling all along. The second marginal note, once properly attended, was not a cross-reference at all, but a key of its own, a shift of 2 letters, where the first had shifted 1, a correction the old man had made to himself, in a hand grown shakier, as though even in his private cipher he had grown afraid of being too easily read. She applied it to the resisting line, and the resisting line gave way. Debitum honoris. She wrote the 2 words on the scrap before her, and stared at them, as though they might rearrange themselves into something less than what they were, a debt of honor, not an entry in a ledger, not a sum carried forward against rents or timber, or the cost of seed corn, but the particular Latin a man reaches for when he means to confess rather than to calculate. She turned the page, the phrase again, buried in a sentence thick with the ordinary business of the estate, drainage, tenancy, a complaint about the mill, as though the old Duke had tried to smuggle his conscience past his own eye by surrounding it with dull matters. Debitum honoris. And a third time, further down, alone on its line, no sentence built around it at all, as though by then he had stopped pretending it was anything but what it was. She sat back. The chair's joints protested faintly in the stillness, a small domestic sound, absurdly loud against the size of what she had just uncovered. 3 Oxford men had sat where she now sat, she thought, and had likely turned these same pages without ever suspecting that beneath the columns of figures and the complaints about the mill lay something a man had been unable to say aloud even to himself, except in a schoolboy's code, 30 years disused. It was not accounts. It had never been accounts. Somewhere in these pages the old Duke was not recording what was owed, but admitting that it had never been paid. Her hand, she noticed, had gone still on the paper, the pen resting rather than writing, and the wax from the guttering candle had cooled in a small hardened bead against her wrist, where she had not felt it fall. Outside the tall windows, the dark had not yet thinned by even a single degree, and the household slept on in its ignorance of what she now knew and did not yet understand. She dipped the pen again. There was more of the sentence to recover, and less night in which to recover it than there had been an hour before, and whatever debt the old man had confessed to owing, she meant to learn its size before the candle failed her. The next line resolved itself under her pen not as a word but as a date, and dates, she had learned in these hours, were the old Duke's anchors, the places where the cipher's careful evasions broke against something too specific to disguise. She wrote it out. 31 years passed in the month of March, when the rains had come without pause for 11 days, and the river below the lower fields had risen past the stone marker her own father, in some other parish, might have called a flood year's warning. She worked the following clause slowly, letter folding into letter, the Greek substitutions peeling back to show the Latin beneath like a second skin. The channel had been neglected. The sentence said, "For 2 seasons prior, the estate's own men having been drawn to the repair of the mill race at my order." She read it twice to be certain she had not supplied the meaning herself, out of some wish to find one, but the words held. He had known. Even as it happened, he had known. The lower fields had drowned in a single night, the water taking the young wheat and the topsoil both, and in the morning, she found this next. In a hand grown visibly less steady even in translation, the strokes of the original crowding closer together as though the writer had wished to finish before he could stop himself. The blame had fallen not upon the neglected channel, nor upon the man who had diverted the laborers from it, but upon the family who had farmed that ruined ground for 3 generations before that night. The Fens, she wrote the name plainly, without cipher, for the old Duke himself had written it plainly, as though even in his private code, some part of him had refused to disguise the one detail that mattered. I told the steward the fault was theirs. The passage continued. For want of clearing the ditch, though I had taken his men from that very work myself, not 4 months prior, and I did not correct him when he gave notice to quit at Michaelmas. Ada set the pen down. Outside, a bird had begun, somewhere in the dark, one thin, uncertain note repeated twice, and she understood without looking that the night's edge had begun, at last, to soften, not yet dawn, but no longer the dead center of it either. She sat with her hands flat upon the desk, the ink drying on her fingers, and thought of a family whose name she had never heard before this hour. Evicted from land they had known longer than the old Duke had known his own title, turned out in the wet aftermath of a ruin that had never been theirs to answer for. There was more beneath it. She could see the shape of another sentence waiting, half-formed, the ink paler where the old man's hand had faltered. She picked the pen back up. The candle had burned to a stub no taller than her smallest finger, and she drew it closer, tilting the page to catch what remained of the light. The next lines came in a smaller hand, cramped, as though the old man had written them in haste, or in shame, or both. "I have resolved," she read, translating each word with the slow, aching care of one handling something that might crumble, "to make good what was taken. 40 pounds, the sum owed for the lease unexpired, and the strip of land along the eastern hedge that was never rightly mine to reclaim, being theirs by 3 generations' labor, before ever a Wrenwood held the deed." She read it twice, to be certain of the tense, the mood, the small grammatical hinge on which the whole confession turned. Not, "I will," but, "I have resolved." A vow spoken, and then, it seemed, never kept. She turned the page. Here the cipher grew erratic, letters crossed out and reset, as though the writer's hand had trembled or his nerve had failed him mid-sentence. "Pride," one fragment read, standing alone, unattached to what came before or after. Then, further down, in ink so faded she had to bring the candle within an inch of the page. "I tell myself each year that I shall write to them, that I shall learn where they have gone, that it is not too late while I yet draw breath. I tell myself this and do nothing, and the years accumulate as debts do. With interest I have not the courage to reckon." She sat back. The chair creaked beneath her, the only sound besides the guttering candle and the bird outside, now joined by a second, their calls overlapping in the gray not yet light. She thought of the old Duke as she had not thought of him before this night, not as a portrait in the gallery, stern and gilt-framed, but as a man alone in this very room, perhaps at this very desk, writing sentences he could not bring himself to speak aloud to another living soul, promising himself a reckoning he kept postponing until postponement became, without his ever choosing it plainly, a kind of answer. There was no further entry on the debt. The remaining pages, she saw, turning them with fingers gone stiff and ink-stained, moved to other matters, the harvest, a mare gone lame, a letter from a bishop, as though the confession had been sealed away in its own small chamber of the book, visited once, then never returned to. She sat very still, the candle throwing its last unsteady light across the page, and understood that she alone, of every soul now living, held the whole of what he had meant to do and never done. The clock on the mantel, which she had not heard strike in hours, chose that moment to sound the 4, each note dropping into the room like a coin into deep water. She counted them without meaning to, the way one counts sheep or footsteps on a stair, and when the last had faded, she found she could not remember the sound of the 3rd. Her hand had gone past aching, into a kind of distant numbness, the pen no longer quite her own instrument, but a thing she guided by habit and will rather than feeling. The candle had shrunk to a stub no higher than her smallest finger, its flame narrow and blue at the base, greedy for the last of the tallow, and she understood, without being told, that it would not last the hour. She had perhaps 20 lines remaining. She had counted them earlier. In a moment of vanity she now regretted, as a traveler counts milestones to steady himself against the length of the road still before him. She worked faster than was wise, and twice caught an error only after the ink had dried, and was forced to strike through with a single decisive line, rather than lose the minutes a fresh sheet would cost her. The old Duke's hand, which had seemed at midnight an adversary, now felt almost familiar to her. The particular slant of his quez, the way he crossed his tows with a flourish, he likely never noticed in himself. She thought, distantly, that she had come to know him better in these 6 hours than most men come to know their own fathers in a lifetime of Sundays. The window had begun, so gradually she could not say when it started, to hold a different quality of dark, not black now, but a deep slate gray, the kind of gray that comes before color returns to the world, before the rooks stir properly in the elms beyond the drive. She became aware of birdsong not as a single note, but as a chorus, thickening, insistent, entirely indifferent to what sat finished or unfinished on the desk before her. She wrote the last line as the candle guttered a final time and did not recover, and sat a moment in the near dark with only the gray window for light, the pen still between her fingers, unwilling for one strange instant to set it down, as though the setting down would make of the night something finished and therefore something lost. Her eyes burned. Her fingers had gone the color of a schoolboy's slate. She looked at the stack of translated pages beside the original, thick now, complete, and felt not triumph but a peculiar hollowness, the specific exhaustion of a task carried to its very last inch. Somewhere beyond the door, she heard the house beginning to wake, a footstep on the stair, the distant clank of a kitchen grate being raked, and she rose, unsteady, to gather what she had made of the night. He came down at 6:15, dressed as though he had not slept either, his cravat tied with the particular carelessness of a man who has tied it himself rather than woken a valet for the office. He had rehearsed, without quite admitting it, the shape of the morning he expected. The library door opened upon an empty candle stub, and a woman gone, or worse, upon a woman still bent stubbornly over pages that refused to yield, her pride not yet ready to confess defeat. He had, if he was honest with the accounting a man does in the gray hour before breakfast, already composed a small kindness to offer her, in place of the impossible thing his mother had asked of her, a coin, folded quietly into her hand, a line about effort being its own worth, some threadbare comfort a household extends to those it has used carelessly. He opened the door and stopped. She had fallen asleep in the chair, her head inclined toward the window, one hand still curled loosely as though the pen had only just been persuaded from it. The candle had burned itself entirely away, a small ruin of wax fused to the dish, and in its place the window gave a thin gray light that lay along the desk without warmth, touching the ink-stained fingers, the exhausted slope of her shoulders, the stack of paper beside her, thick, ordered, covered edge to edge in a hand grown smaller and more careful as the night wore on, as though economy of motion had become, by 4 o'clock, a kind of prayer. He did not wake her at once. He stood instead in the doorway with the peculiar stillness of a man recalculating the whole of an evening's expectation, and let his eye travel once more over the pages, not reading them yet, only registering their sheer improbable existence, the fact of their completeness where 3 Oxford men had left him nothing but their apologetic silence and an unopened cabinet. Somewhere behind him he heard the butler's step slow on the flagstones, then stop altogether, the old man taking in the same scene with an expression the Duke did not turn to see but could well imagine, having known it on that face before. A private, unhurried satisfaction, the look of a servant who has quietly wagered on the right side of a thing for 40 years and is in no rush to say so aloud. The Duke crossed the room at last and lifted the topmost page. His father's hand, and beneath it, hers, patient, exact, terrible, in what it was already beginning to say. He read one line, then stopped, and looked back at her sleeping face, as though it might explain what the words could not yet bear to. He read the confession through twice before he permitted himself to understand it, the way a man will walk twice past a door he suspects holds bad news, hoping the second passage might reveal a different room behind it. It did not. The words remained where she had set them, in her small governess's hand, each Latin clause resolved into plain English with a scholar's mercy. She had not softened a syllable, but she had not sharpened one either. She had simply rendered his father's guilt into a language he could no longer pretend not to speak. He found that his thumb had gone to his signet ring, turning it once, twice, a habit from boyhood he thought he had long since surrendered, turning it the way his father used to turn it, in the moments before an unpleasant tenant meeting, before a difficult letter, before anything that asked of him more honesty than he wished to give. The Duke had not known he still carried the gesture in his own hand until he felt the metal warm under his thumb, and recognized, with a small cold shock, whose fingers he was imitating. 11 years he had kept that cabinet locked, not from ignorance of what might be inside, but from a private, unexamined certainty that whatever his father had left unsaid was better left unsaid still, that grief undisturbed was grief managed, and a debt unspoken might, with enough silence, cease to exist at all. He saw now how convenient that arithmetic had been, how it had cost him nothing but a locked door and a decade of not looking. He read the final page. £40. A parcel of land along the drainage channel his father had blamed them for neglecting, when the fault, his father had written it himself, in his own concealed hand, under his own devised cipher, as though even confession required a disguise. The fault had lain with the estate's own poor engineering, and no one else's. The Duke stood very still. Outside, the birds had begun in earnest, indifferent to the hour's wait, and somewhere below, a door opened and closed with the ordinary sound of a house resuming its day. He did not move toward it. He stood instead with the pages in his hand and felt something in him that had been braced for 11 years, against grief, against blame, against the particular helplessness of loving a man who had died before he could be forgiven or condemned. Quietly, finally, let go its hold. He did not decide what he would do. He simply found, looking down at her, sleeping in the chair his father's guilt had kept from resolution, that he already knew. The breakfast room, when the Dowager entered it a little before 8, still smelled of the night's rain that had not quite finished falling, and of toast going cold under its silver dome. She had slept badly, or perhaps not at all, though she would not have named the cause of it even to herself, only that she had lain awake listening for a sound from the library that never came, and had risen at last with the particular irritability of a woman who has been kept from sleep by her own conscience and resents the intrusion. She stopped at the threshold. 2 places were laid, her own, at the head, where it had always been laid, and beside it, where no place had ever been laid in 11 years for anyone but family, a second setting, cup, saucer, a small dish of preserves, the good spoons rather than the everyday ones. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the butler, who stood near the sideboard with the particular blankness of a man who has anticipated a question and prepared no answer for it, because none had been asked of him. "I did not order this," she said. "It was not quite a question." "No, Your Grace." "Then who did?" He did not answer at once, and in the space of his not answering, she understood, with the swiftness of a woman who has spent 40 years reading servants' silences, that no one had ordered it at all, that he had simply said it, the way he had set a second lump of coal on the library fire through the night, The way he had climbed the stairs 3 times to see whether the candle yet burned, because some things in a house of long service arrange themselves without instruction, once the shape of what is owed becomes clear enough to see. She sat down. She did not order the place removed. She waited, in a silence that surprised even her with its patience, while the tea cooled and the toast grew colder still, and she found that the words she had ready, the small cruelties, the observations about governesses who overstayed their welcome, and joke-tellers who took liberties with a duchess's hospitality, would not come to her tongue in any order that satisfied her. She turned her rings instead. She looked once toward the door. When at last it opened, and her son entered with the pages in his hand, and a look on his face she had not seen there since his father's funeral, she said nothing cruel at all, which was, for her, its own kind of confession, though she would rather have gone hungry than call it that. He set the pages beside her plate before he sat, as though they were a thing too important to hold at a distance any longer. His mother watched him do it, and said nothing, and the nothing was its own answer, heavier than any word she might have chosen the night before. He did not eat. He turned his cup once on its saucer, the small china click loud in a room that had learned, over the course of one long night, how to listen. Then he asked her, not across the table, in the manner of a man conferring an honor, but low, as though the question had cost him something to shape, whether she might come again on Thursday. To help him draft the letter, he said, to the Fenn family, wherever they might now be found, however many years it took to find them. He said it plainly. The way a man asks for help, he does not know how to ask for otherwise, and he did not look away while he waited for her answer. She said yes. It was the smallest word she had spoken in that house, and it seemed to settle something in the room more thoroughly than the whole long night of cipher and candlelight had done. The Dowager reached for the toast rack, and finding it empty, rang the small bell at her elbow without comment, and when the butler entered to refill it, he saw the second place still set, still occupied, and understood, as he had understood a great many things in that house across 40 years of quiet service, that he was not to remark upon it. Later, when the library had been aired, and the cabinet stood open on its ruined lock for anyone to see, the Duke had a chair brought nearer the window, an old chair, high-backed, its cushion faded where afternoon light had worn it thin over some previous decade of use, and set it beside the shelf where his father's journal now rested, its final page translated, its confession no longer a secret kept from daylight. No one instructed the chair to be understood as hers. No one needed to. The butler, passing through with the coal scuttle, paused before it a moment, the way a man might pause before a thing recently and rightly named, and then went on about his morning, as if nothing at all had changed in a house where, in fact, a great deal had. Outside, the fog that had lain over the drive at 10 the previous evening had long since burned away, and the fields beyond the terrace, the same fields, some said, where a channel had once failed to hold back a flood 31 years before, lay pale and ordinary under the risen sun, waiting, as fields do, for whatever debts the living might finally see